Welcome to What's the Story Dublin, the official Dublin City Council podcast with me, your host, Deirdre Malumbi. This podcast deep dives into the work of all the moving parts that make up Dublin City Council. It also shares news of the Council's latest initiatives and exciting events. In today's episode, we're looking at planning. I'm delighted to be joined today by Deirdre Scully, who is Dublin City Planning Officer here in Dublin City Council. Deirdre, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Deirdre, can you first of all tell me a little bit about how you came to work for Dublin City Council and a little bit about your current role?
Okay. I did a degree in geography and then ended up doing a master's in planning in UCD and worked in a whole range of different places from Ballymun on kind of community issues right through about 3 or 4 other local authorities, and I joined and then worked on a regional level as well, and I joined Dublin City Council in 2010 and I've been there ever since. And my role at the moment as City Planning Officer is to lead the professional team within Dublin, in the planning section of Dublin City. So that's all the planning staff, conservation, archaeology, technicians in the drawing office and heritage also. So there's a wide breadth of professional skills within the section.
And I'm sure in terms of scale, you know, compared to like the regional, it's much bigger team, much bigger work than you've ever done before. Is that it?
Yeah, I'd say bar on Penala, which would have a huge team as well. We're the biggest local authority from a professional point of view, and we're the second biggest employer of planners in the country. So we would have about 66 positions within the council for planning staff, and on top of that, then we would have another 20 for other professionals. So it's a broad, big team, but you know, Dublin is a very busy place, so we need all that. We handle over 4,000 applications a year for planning, so it's a lot of work. Absolutely.
And planning is such a huge topic, and it sounds like you're the absolutely perfect person to talk to us today about all of this, Deirdre. So can you start off by telling me a little bit about what does planning actually mean and what areas does it relate to in Dublin City Council? I'm sure the answer is all areas, but
I suppose, yeah. What is planning? I suppose planning is a process for managing resources. So from in the natural and built environment, and it first came into place in Ireland in the 1963 Planning Act. That was the first kind of major piece of legislation that set the whole planning process up and running. And one of the things that's really important about how it framed it was it referred to the common good, and it's about managing how things get done, where they get done, when they get done, and what that is, and where we protect and where we don't protect. And it's all framed around the concept of the common good, because obviously planning very much affects property rights. So it's about how we balance those rights with the needs of society and the importance of nature, and how we manage all of those things, and to look at it in a strategic way, and then from that strategic perspective make individual decisions. Because everything from somebody deciding to build a piggery with 500 pigs in it to somebody building a house extension, they all have impacts. So it's a question of how you manage those impacts and what needs to happen with those things to ensure that there's no serious impact either on adjoining people, or maybe say something like that has an environmental impact that may have an impact on a river, you know, and it might be 20 miles away before that impact is realised. So there's all that connectivity. You have to look at the bigger perspective.
Absolutely. And when it comes to Dublin City Council and planning, people always have to remember that term, I suppose, refers to both housing and the city itself, the planning of it.
It's everything, anything that gets built, or any major change of use of a building. So if you own a shop and you want to turn it into a pub, that requires planning permission. If you're building an office block, and right down to building, say, putting in a new driveway and building a porch in your front garden, all of those are planning. So planning is everything that involves works or a significant change of use.
Absolutely. What are the different types of planning permission?
Well, I suppose I'm wary of using kind of names, because the Planning Act has just been changed, and all of the kind of names that you would have on these different will all change with the Act. So I suppose there's a standard planning application you make to a local authority. So for us, obviously, it's DCC. If you're living in a different council area, you apply to your own council. And that planning application in the main is an 8-week process. You lodge, you get your drawings done up, you stick your notice in the paper, and you put up your site notice outside, so you let people who may be affected by what you're proposing to do to know about it. And then once you've got a copy of those and you put them in with your application, and it goes through an 8-week process where the council reviews those. We might send your application then maybe to our drainage section, or say if it has an impact on a street tree, or if it involves open space, we'll send it to the park section and we'll ask them for an opinion. The same with traffic. And others, depending on how complex the application is, it could end up going to 10 different sections in the council. And they all have a couple of weeks to go through the file, have a look at what's proposed and come back to us with their comments. And then we would look at all of the comments that come in. Say if it was a building that was protected, it would go to conservation. So there's a whole different issues. We would have a look at that. And if, having reviewed all the documentation, it is, I suppose, tested against what is the policy for that area, what is the zoning of those lands, and they're all dictated by the city development plan, which is kind of the strategic plan for the entire city. So every application is tested against the development plan and what the policies and objectives in that plan are. So if it's considered to fit well with what the development plan is saying we want the city to be like, well then it'll be granted. Or there may be some things that are missing that maybe aren't cleared. Maybe some of the pipe connections, we're not sure where they're going, or they don't add up, the levels are wrong or something. We'll write back and ask for more information. They have a set period of time to come back to us with that information, and if they come back and answer the questions, then it'll get granted. Then there's a period of time where you wait to see if somebody appeals it, if they've made a submission. And if they do, well then obviously that's a different process. So that's a standard planning application. There are other types of applications called large-scale residential development, and it's kind of like a sort of a much more structured process where somebody who's building a very large amount of apartments or houses has to come into the council, and they have to come and talk to us in advance. They can't just throw it in. And so it's to allow a much, a better quality development to come forward by having those conversations in advance and pushing for kind of good design, making sure they meet all the standards. And again, and then when those applications go to An Bord Pleanála again, they're kind of not fast tracked, but they're prioritised. That way, so there is clarity in how long it'll take. And then there are other things called strategic infrastructure, which is stuff like I suppose if you were building the M50 now, that would be considered strategic infrastructure. Or Metro is a good example, I suppose, a very recent one, where they don't apply to Dublin City Council, they apply straight to An Bord Pleanála because they're so big. So like the likes of wind farms, wastewater treatment plants, big complex engineering projects go to An Bord Pleanála directly as an application. And then our role then is to write in, like everybody else, with our views, having reviewed the documents. We go through all the stuff and say, well, this is what we think about that, and we would send it in. We would have done one very recently there for the Codling wind farm, which is a really large wind farm off the shore of Wicklow, but the cables for it and the kind of the substations and stuff are all in Poolbeg, because that's where it's connected into the grid. So we as a council would have written in with the views of what all our technical teams think of all what's in that, and then also what the councillors thought was also collected and put in with that submission, and it was all sent to the board for them to make the decision. So there's a number of different types of applications there, but they'd be the main ones.
Absolutely. And you mentioned there actually the planning appeals process. Can you tell us a bit about that? And is that something that you can avail of, kind of whether it's a smaller scale or kind of the bigger scale projects you would have mentioned there too? Like
anyone can make an appeal, but they have to have made a submission on the application in the first place to us. They can't just sort of start raising issues like after we've gone through a process. So then there are exceptions to that, like certain designated organisations can, but in the main, there are two types of people make appeals. The applicant, if they don't like our decision, which especially if they don't like maybe one of the conditions of the decision, they might think, we might have, say if it was a hotel, we might have lopped off 2 floors. Now lopped is very it's a bit rough, but you know what I mean. But where we might have amended the scheme by condition, and they might contest that. They want to contest that, so they will go to An Bord Pleanála and make the case as to why they need those 2 floors, or why maybe the impact that we thought those floors would have isn't as severe as we made it out to be. And they'll make their pitch then to argue for them back. Or a person who lives adjoining a development or somewhere else. They can be from somebody passing through, but as long as they've engaged with the process from the start, they can make an appeal and say why they think an application shouldn't go ahead, or maybe they're seeking a change to it or something. So but it's an open and transparent process. Every submission we get goes onto the public file. All the documentation is there, and all of that goes to the board. So the board gets to review the entire decision, not necessarily the bit that's been argued in the appeal. So they start from square one and say, right, okay, what's this? And they will now, under the new legislation, have a set period of time to do that. At the moment, it's a little bit open-ended, which can be a challenge.
And what happens when the planning is unauthorised? And is that kind of linked, or is it separate to this idea of planning enforcement, which I understand Dublin City Council has a role in that too?
Yeah, we would have a dedicated enforcement section within the council with inspectors who go out in response to issues raised by the public or by the councillors or others, where we would need people to write in or email in or whatever with raising something.
So they have to make direct contact.
You have to. We have to have a reason to initiate it. And sometimes it's officials as well. Like if certain things are seen by any staff, we can also raise issues as well. But there's kind of two types of unauthorised development. There's stuff that they never applied for planning, but they probably should have, that way. So that would be, I suppose, an unauthorised development. But then there's also situations where somebody has permission and they're building something, but then while they're building it, they start changing it. And it ends up being different. So those are those two. We would get a huge amount of issues raised with DCC. It would be, in the high hundreds every year, way. So there's a huge amount of work, and sometimes when the inspectors go out and check the sites, it can be like people see works going on, but when you actually look into it, they don't actually need planning for it, or the way, or it. But what happens is if there is a question mark over whether maybe it's halfway built and we're not clear exactly how big or how high it is, we have the right to contact the person and to say to them, you have a month to come back to us to tell us what you're doing is exempt and to show us how it will be, or to rectify the situation or remove it, that way. So there's a number of tools there that we can go through to ensure that people comply once we've been made aware of anything. But I suppose people are unsure, they can just ask the council to look into it, that way. And they can check the planning record, which is the register, which is kind of a map of the entire city with all of the planning applications that have ever been made, and it's in digital and paper form. And you can have a look at that to see, well, is your man down the road who's building something, did he actually get planning permission and I just didn't notice, that way, or whatever. So people can check to see what the permission looked like and is what's going up what they said they were going to build, that way. So there's a number of different routes there. But yeah, it's an important part, because there's no point in having a structure unless you're clear that people need to stay within what they sought, So.
And you actually touched on there, Deirdre, something I was going to ask about, which is, when are there exemptions for planning? And, is this kind of touch and go? Is it very specific, or is it still kind of being defined? There's
what's called the regulations, which is, it's very jargonistic, but it's like a huge telephone book of rules and regulations as to how planning is implemented on a day-to-day basis. So the regulations tell us things like what needs to go into the site notice for planning applications or the form, but it also sets out all the rules about what doesn't need permission. But it's all qualified. So you can build a porch, but it has to be below a set square meterage, or you can build an extension, but it has to be, it can't be any bigger than this. And if you go up 2 stories, that bit can only be as, so things are qualified. So the likes of ESB, there's certain works they can do, but then there's a qualifier on it saying it can't get to this scale or this size. So if a utility company needs to dig up the road and lay pipes and put in a small thing, where they have connections and whatever, a lot of that is exempt development, because it's necessary in relation to the public good. And also the planning system would be completely clogged up if every single small extension was coming into us. We would have 10,000 planning applications a year, not 4.5, so it is important that we manage that. The only thing I suppose just to flag is that where you have a building that's on the record of protected structures, what I suppose people used to call listed, is like heritage buildings like Georgian houses and all that sort of stuff, the Custom House, all these lovely buildings, and there's a whole range of them. We actually have 9,000 of them.
Particularly in Dublin.
Yeah, we've 9,000, way more than everywhere else. But, that's because we're the capital city and the history that we have. But they would have, suppose that would be one of the qualifiers, is they don't have the same types of exemptions. Because obviously small works can have a huge impact on a heritage building, whereas on a standard house or a standard back garden, if you're building a shed, they wouldn't necessarily have the same. But the regulations are kind of what set the code as to what you can do without having to come through planning, because we don't want people to have to spend a huge amount of time and money and resources coming through planning for stuff that really doesn't have a significant impact. And one of the things just to flag to people is that there is, now that there's been a new Planning Act passed, all the regulations are going to be rewritten, and there will be the department have flagged to us that there will be an engagement process as part of that, and they intend to going out to public consultation to ask people's views as to what they think should be exempt development and what shouldn't be, and or what those boundaries as to where it tips from being exempt into not being exempt is. So
we'll have to get
all
back.
Change. Yeah,
we'll have to get you back in later to talk about all of these changes. Yeah, it's exciting to see. You actually touched there on the idea of heritage, and I was wondering, how does kind of the environment, heritage and stuff like that factor into planning? Is that kind of a big issue that comes up a lot? Yeah, I suppose I haven't talked to you about the development plan sets, I suppose, the strategic vision for the city, and then all the different policies and objectives as to how planning will actively look to create a better city. So some of that is preservation of historic buildings and spaces and places within that. And so you'll have like the built heritage assets that the city has, and making sure that those buildings are protected. And there are tools in the legislation as well that, where buildings are being neglected, that the council can go after the owners and remind them of their responsibilities. And the flip side is we also have a carrot. We do offer grants to help people keep their buildings in good order and all that as well. So there is there's two sides to that. But there's also the natural heritage side. So like, say, the parks and the river valleys and all that, they all have zoning policies to protect them and to ensure that their biodiversity value is reflected in the policies and objectives. So they would have kind of a zoning protection on a lot of that. The parks, football, all these places that people enjoy, the canals. Alongside that, I suppose there are national aspects and international European legislation that also impacts on planning. So all plans, all projects, all have to go through an environmental assessment. So you will have an environmental report that looks at the wider environmental impact of a development once it's above a certain size and scale, and also an appropriate assessment, which is for, I suppose, to look at specifically at protected places. So Dublin Bay would be an example of a protected place, so where certain habitats like Bull Island, which are extremely sensitive, and there's designated bird species or other species that are within those. And any major plan, any plan or project has to look at that and has to ensure that it doesn't do anything that's going to have a serious negative impact on it. So it's totally knitted in to the planning process, because everything we do, whether it's policy or planning decisions, all have to look at the environmental impact. Brilliant. Can you talk to us, Deirdre, a little bit about this idea of strategic planning? I know it was kind of a phrase you mentioned earlier, so can you explain exactly what that means, and if it's possible to kind of summarise it?
Yeah, sure. I suppose the planning process has two sides. There's the planning applications, there's enforcement, I suppose, which is kind of almost part of the planning applications process, because it's looking at what individually needs permission and what doesn't. And then the other core part of it is planning policy. So you have a national planning policy called the National Planning Framework, and then you have regional policies, which kind of split the country up into three and look at how you take the national policy and bring it down a level. And then you have each local authority then has their own planning policy, and that's a city or a county development plan. The thing to note about the whole policy world, that is all decisions of the elected councillors or the elected TDs at national level. So each of those is their mandate, that's part of their core functions, is to make decisions about planning policy for their area. So it is a very important democratic function of the elected councillors, and something that people should always bear in mind when their councillors or TDs are calling to their door. The development plan will go through, all the different issues that may affect. So for Dublin, like, we have a chapter on retail economy, we have a chapter on built form and height, on housing and built form, and what community infrastructure needs to go with housing, what open space and parks and water infrastructure is needed, and traffic management. All those things are all in that, and they all kind of set the rules around how planning applications are assessed. So the development plan is a really important document for the city, and it's written every 6 years at the moment. Under the new Act, it's going to be written every 10 years. And there's, I suppose, because it takes about 2.5 years to write the thing, they figure it makes more sense for it to be a 10-year document. So one of the things that's really important at a much more local level is that in a development plan, it will identify places where we want to do more local area type plans. So there are certain parts of the city where you kind of go, there's going to be significant change, so we need to do a very detailed plan on those. And they, again, also are decisions of the elected members of your councillors. And we would go through a whole process of public consultation before we start, and then when we make it, and if there's changes made to what went out on display, they come back in and those changes are commented on, and all of that is presented to the councillors, and then they make the final decision as to what the final document will be. And then any planning application that comes in has to meet what's in that plan. So again, it's another kind of way of ensuring that the common good is embedded into the planning process. So.
And I suppose there are factors that would distinguish, Dublin and how planning works in Dublin and Dublin city centre compared to kind of other regions, if you can speak a bit to that.
Yeah, I suppose like the process is exactly the same because it's all in legislation, and I suppose the procedure and how long we have to make decisions is fixed for us, whether you're in Leitrim or whether you're in Docklands. So from that point of view, the process in how you deal with it as a member of the public is exactly the same. I suppose what makes us different is that we get an awful lot more complex, much bigger applications in the norm. We would also have what are called SDZs, or strategic development zones. We've 3. We've one in Grange Gorman, we've one in Docklands actually, and we've another one in Poolbeg. And they're kind of a hybrid of kind of policy and plan and kind of applications, because what they've done is they've gotten much more detailed, and they've gone to the board with the plan rather than gone to the board with an application. And so when you make an application in those areas, there's no appeal to the board because the board has already made a decision about how that area is going to develop. So they're a bit unique. There are a few more around the country, but we would have, I suppose the other one people would be familiar with would be Adamstown in South Dublin, which has been under development quite a long time as well. So there's a few around the Dublin area, but I suppose, essentially the process is the same as to how people experience it. Planning applications have an 8-week period. They go, all the documentation's put up on public display in the council offices or on the website, and people have 5 weeks to make a submission. So it is the same from that point of view. So
standardised, yeah. Exactly. And what are some of the types of services and support that are available to the public through Dublin City Council in terms of learning, more about the planning process itself, but then also seeking their own planning permission?
I suppose there was a series of leaflets that were done by the department and the Office of the Planning Regulator, which is kind of another civil service arm that kind of is both a monitoring and ensuring compliance body that exists as well. And there's they have a whole series of little leaflets that kind of go through what is planning and how do you make a planning application, how do I object to a planning application. There's a whole collage of them. They're on DCC's website. We can also get them on the Department of Housing website or on the Office of the Planning Regulator website. They all have links to them, so they're quite handy. Our own website would have all information on applications lodged with ourselves, copies of all the plans, and some of the older local plans that we've done and the ones that are currently out in consultation. Information on the record of protected structures and a whole range of different, all of that information is there. If people are interested in making planning applications, the organisation, we would have teams of people that deal with planning applications in different areas, and if somebody's interested in making a planning application, we offer people the opportunity to come in and have a chat with us about how they think their application should go, what they need to include in it. So because it's in their interest and in our interest that they get a good application together, because if they get it in and it's all good and it's they've got all the right documentation and they've taken account of the impact on the adjoining buildings or neighbours, well then it's a much smoother process for everybody involved. So so we aim to ensure that anybody that is interested in having a chat with us before they lodge an application, that we will arrange or facilitate that, and whether if they want to, it can be on Teams or they can come into the office, whichever.
Fantastic. And is there anything else actually covered by the planning department in Dublin City Council that you'd love for people to be a bit more aware of that we haven't mentioned today?
Yeah, we have a heritage office which is very involved in promoting local heritage. So we ran a community archaeology project in St. Anne's during the summer. There's a whole range of smaller projects that we're involved in, some conservation management plans for the graveyards in Dublin City, so the likes of St. Canis's and a few others. There's been, we chase money from the department and other places like this to run these little projects and to get them up and running, which is really positive. We have a grant scheme for heritage buildings, so for people who need to do improvements, maybe they need to replace the windows or the roof or guttering or something. There's a range of grant options out there, and we get involved in all of the big projects in the same way, and we would chip in with I suppose our colleagues colleagues in other departments if they're making, because obviously the local authority is a developer as well, so we would be involved in discussions and give reports in relation to, say, social housing development and work on that. But when we would give advice to the likes of the National Transport Authority and Irish Water about growth projections, about where we see population growth in the future, so that their plans align with what we're trying to achieve, because we're, I suppose, in some ways trying to ensure that through the planning process and the development plan document that there is alignment with investment, because where we want to see, you know, more housing delivered and where those opportunities are, we want to ensure that all the agencies that contribute. So we would give information to the likes of the Department of Education, because they can model where they think schools demand will be, and they come back to us when they say, oh, we have a peak of children in preschool in this particular area, we're going to need to expand the schools, and then we can look with them then at opportunity sites and stuff like that. So there is that kind of constant stream of information back and forward with different branches of the state and different organisations as well. So
yeah, and that sense of collaboration, I suppose, exactly. Great, Deirdre. I suppose my very last question for you then would be, what big projects are kind of coming up for planning from Dublin City Council, say for 2025 and even beyond?
Well, I suppose we've one very big project at the moment, which is a local plan for what's called Dublin Industrial Estate, which is in Glasnevin, and we've given it the townland name for the area, which is Ballybogan, and which is between the Royal Canal and the Tolka, between the just off the Finglas Road there. So it's a huge area of industrial land, which was, I think, built in the 1950s by Dublin Corporation. But it's a very interesting place. But it is, I suppose, it has changed, and so there's an opportunity there to provide higher density development, and for some of the older sheds and stuff to be replaced with something that has better value in the long run. So we're looking at a regeneration plan for that. So that's a big piece of work that will go out in public consultation, and we'll be inviting people to make submissions on that, and it will go to the councillors for comment and discussion for them to make a final decision in the end. But it'll take a while. We've also got another study underway in Chicor. We would work quite a bit with the Land Development Agency as well, because they have taken over a number of state lands, and there's quite a bit of state land out there. So the Inchicore Railway works, and there's a few other sites as well. So they're looking at a strategy for how that area will develop in the medium term, and we're working with that. So hopefully that in 2025 will go out on public display for discussion as well. And in 2026 the City Development Plan comes up for review. So that's something I would hope that people look out for, because we have a pre-draft consultation phase, which is at the start, where we ask people for their opinion as to what the plan needs to focus on. It's really important. It's really, really important to get that spread of why people think certain things should happen in Dublin, because it was very interesting the last time, because it was during COVID. So we think we did our first consultation during the first lockdown, and then we were really looking at our second consultation was in the second lockdown, which was a bit of a shame. But what it did was it had, I suppose, in every cloud there's a silver lining. There was so much interest in people's local area, in their local parks, in what their local village was like, and how the footpaths, the cycleways, all these things came through so much stronger in the submissions that we got, because people had focused on them so much during COVID, which was a really positive thing, and it had a really strong benefit to how the plan was written. It changed how the plan was written and the tone that the plan took. So that is really important. So I would hope that as we head toward 2026, that people keep an eye out for the posters and the advertising and the public consultation and the social media to take the opportunity to engage with at least one of the stages of the public consultation for the development plan.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Deirdre. Plenty to keep you busy anyway. And thank you so much again. I really do appreciate you taking out the time to speak to me today about all things planning.
Not at all.
And thanks again to today's guest, Deirdre Scully. I'd also like to extend my thanks to our audio engineer and editor, Robert Fay. This podcast was produced by myself, Deirdre Malumbi, and Michael Ryan, and recorded in the Central Library Studio. Be sure to spread the word if you're enjoying What's the Story Dublin, and to like and subscribe for future episodes. Slán go fóill.